On this program, some thoughtful people from prosperous nations consider how their countries can help the poorer ones. They look at the task from the practical standpoint, what's in it for us?
The great compelling ground, the obvious one, is that if you're the rich man in town and the poor folks are getting restive, you ought to, calm them down by improving their lot. Otherwise, they're going to come down and take over your orchard.
If the 2 billion people who are about to enter on development are condemned to go through the kind of experience that all of the now developed nations of the world have gone through, we can expect that the next half century, a century, will see the world in shambles, and the developed nations of the world will disappear from the face of the earth.
Now, I think that the main problem consists in having such a situation in the developed part of the world that it understands that its historical interest, not only task, morally taken, but its material interest consists in helping and in a very efficient and very quick way the underdeveloped countries to develop.
Another one is the gap between the advanced and the developing countries. This gap is so great that if it existed within a nation, you would diagnose a certainty of revolution in that nation. You certainly wouldn't anticipate a peaceful future for that nation.
Well, we ought to know by now what we can't do about it. We can't use military means any longer to keep these people off our backs without blowing up the whole world. And so if we wanted to put it in crass terms of self-interest, it seems to me the answer is that we've got to reduce the gap between the rich and poor, tolerable dimensions, so that there is not this drive of hunger and poverty, which surely will bring down the rich nations if it reaches a peak of intensity.
There is a second selfish interest, if we have to put it this way, to excite sentiment and political sentiment in favor of development. It's to be seen in the fact that America, the United States of America, does more business with Canada, which has a population about equal to that of the state of New York, than it does with all of Latin America, which has a population greater than that of the entire U.S. population.
It is not only the problem of trade, it's a problem of production, it's a problem of co-production, it's a problem just of having a world so as it is. It means also economically unified. Now here is, I would say, also a technological problem. It is a purely economic problem, which brings us closer and closer together, even if we do not wish to have it.
On the purely economic level, the advanced countries are going to need markets if their own economic life is not going to be flooded by abundance. And I think you can therefore prove that it's hard-headed, for example, for the United States or for Europe to wish to see Africa develop into a big consumer's market. In the previous century, as colonial powers, their interest was to prevent a sophisticated economy and society arising in Africa, because this would obviously challenge their domination. Today, in the post-colonial era, they have a very definite interest in the development of heavy consumer markets and more sophisticated technological populations.
Well, I know a lot of people will say, but this is nonsense. Economic assistance to underdeveloped areas is a central part of governmental policy these days, and governments are giving considerable sums in economic assistance. But I wonder whether we really do it with the right and central purpose. Nations give it for their own national interests. They give it to stop the people they don't like. They give it to gain friends for the causes they do like and so forth. I don't think they see it as a potentially international effort to carry the revolution of science and technology and abundance to all mankind, which is now possible. And because of this, I don't think that the positive purposes are put in proper perspective, nor, frankly, do I think we do enough.
We have not yet matured, any of us apparently, as nations, to the point where we're willing to go all the way in any important area like this internationally. We still have our nationalist overtones. We think that there's propaganda advantage to be gained by having whatever we may do overseas identified with our country and stamped U.S. The Soviet Union obviously feels the same way.
The nature of aid is misunderstood, it seems to me. People think of it as charity. It is a gross error to think of it in such terms. The 10% that's squandered on armaments is equal to the entire gross national product of the developing countries. The 10% that is squandered on armaments is a measure of the surplus productive capacity of the developed nations. It's a measure, in short, of their capacity to come to the assistance of the developing nations. Now, they have a urgent stake in hastening and accelerating the development of the developing nations.
Then, if it is true that we are spending about $150 billion yearly for armament, even 10% of it would be enough just to give all we should give for the moment to the underdeveloped countries for a quick development of this part of the world.
I would like to see the 1% of national income, which is talked of as the contribution of the wealthy nations to the poor, and which isn't reached, incidentally. I would like to see that, in a sense, as a minimum, as a starting point. After all, we all grow by 3% a year at a minimum, and therefore if we were to devote 1% to the development of poorer nations, we shouldn't exactly be worse off. We might perhaps be slowing down our own rate of wealth-making a little, but that doesn't seem to me to be a tremendous sacrifice, shall we say, to make in this cause.
The developing countries have got to industrialize in order to increase their productivity. The increase in productivity is the only way out of the Malthusian trap in which they're now living, into which they've been doomed for the past 5,000 years. The developing nations of the world are now going through very rapid population increases. This is the result, of course, of death control, with their birth rates remaining at the classically high rate which has barely sustained populations of agricultural countries over centuries, or has sustained only the slowest kind of growth. Their explosive growth in population has come with death control. Now, nothing can stem or reverse the growth of the world population. No amount of propaganda on behalf of Planned Parenthood can accomplish this end. The only way population control can be achieved is through economic development. There are many higher priority public health and individual health problems besetting, let's say, the villager of India or the villager of Latin America than the question of family planning. From his own personal point of view, he hasn't got a stake in the question of population control until the time when his individual well-being is showing significant and subjectively appreciable increase and improvement. And when it does, he can begin to make the arithmetic calculation that shows that fewer mouths in the family mean more for each to eat.
Then you have the problem of the maldistribution of knowledge. This is the golden age of scientific advance. The life of this generation is dominated by the power of reason and its influence on every human activity, and yet some 700 million people, 1/3 of the adult population of the world, are completely illiterate, and at least an equal number at a low level of literacy. Those are three problems: the population problem, the gap in economic standards, and the gap in intellectual or technological standards.
The problems of the developing world are many. Poor nations are not equipped to meet natural disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, or drought. The people of the developing nations are bound to primitive methods of agriculture. Without machines or knowledge, they cannot break the bonds that tie them to poverty. Without public health protection or the barest minimum of medical care, they are still victims of tuberculosis, yaws, tropical fevers, leprosy. It can take scores of men as long as 6 hours to pull in this net. If it makes sense for the rich nations to help the poor, how should they do it? International Zone will return in just a moment.
There are more children in the world today than there were people 100 years ago. Most of them live in countries where there is hunger and disease and ignorance. If their generation is to have a future, their health must be protected, their hands and minds prepared for a full life. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, is helping to nurture and to teach children in more than 100 countries. These boys and girls have grown up strong with help from UNICEF. Millions of others still wait to be helped. Why don't you help UNICEF?
The developed countries, apart from all the romance that surrounds aid as part of the moral duty and so forth, well, it has to be understood in terms of the new picture of human ecology with which mankind has got to learn to live. We all live on this planet Earth together, and the welfare of every man in the world is inextricably tied up with the welfare of all others. We cannot have a world polity in which there are a few rich nations and many poor, in which there are a few rich people and many poor people.
You see, in previous generations you could have expected the underdeveloped countries to accept their lot with meekness, partly because they were dominated by religions of fatalism and resignation, and partly because they didn't know the opportunities available to them. You could be poor in Africa or in the middle of Latin America and not know that there was such a thing as a richer life anywhere. Well, today communications, especially cinema, television, all bring them a picture of the more abundant life, and therefore the impatience with their existing lot is much greater. And therefore you have a much sharpened intensity today in the desire for equality, economic and social. That's one element which makes for the need for rapidity of movement. We now have a population of 3,000 million in the world, but half of that is undernourished. What makes us think that in 35 years we're going to be able to feed 6,000 million people when we can't now feed 3,000 million effectively? Therefore, I think the element of urgency arises wherever you look, strategically, economically, agriculturally, demographically.
You have in Zambia, at the moment of independence, because as you remember it became independent on October 24th, United Nations Day, and they deliberately chose United Nations Day as a day of independence because they wanted to indicate that they were going to base their policies on non-alignment and a basic approach along the lines of the principles of the UN Charter. Well, at the moment of independence, this country finds itself with less than 1,000 Africans that have been trained to matriculation, school leaving standard, with less than 100 university graduates. And with this, you have to build a nation. And this is why it is critically important in these years immediately after independence for the African states to be able to turn to other countries to bring in the skilled people that will help them in this biding time while they're training their own people.
The experience that our country has had in getting a lot of production out of a small amount of soil and of a rational and intensive rural planning is of great significance in the central crisis of our times, which is how to prevent the Malthusian equation from developing. And there must be dozens of countries for whom that's an urgent and poignant problem. So here there's a basic necessity for cooperation between countries which are not great countries, but which have experience to offer to each other.
I think American policy in Southeast Asia might be very different if the American people knew that the Mekong River Valley plan was all ready to be mounted as an engineering enterprise. If we'd been working on the harnessing of the Mekong River for the past 10 years in Southeast Asia, we would have seen pacification of the country, of the nations of Southeast Asia. The UN Special Fund has spent quite modest sums in the past 10 years. It's laid the foundation for the expenditure of from 50 to 200 times the money that's been spent to do the engineering and hard planning. The UN technical agencies ought to be better known to my fellow citizens and to the citizens of industrial countries generally, because they would then have more confidence in the functioning of international agencies in development. It seems essential to me that, as I hope, and actually I'm almost willing to predict, that economic development on the scale on which I've been talking is going to come. It's got to come. I think it's vital that as the build-up comes, major portions of the capital development programs be channeled through international agencies.
It's going to take international cooperation, and it's going to take international organization. We've been pretty wistful in this country, thinking that somehow this would take place automatically, that all kind of people of goodwill would go running around and start enterprises abroad, and surplus capital and surplus executive energy and retired businessmen would go out and do this kind of thing on a kind of an individual basis, and this seems to me to be nonsense. My own view, we should build this aspect of the United Nations as rapidly and as strongly as we can. This is actually the one instrument we have where there is practical, hard-headed cooperation already in existence.
Now we are doing already, but we are doing it also in the spirit of a politically divided world. It means in the spirit of competition and fight. And in this domain, this does not help, and everybody knows it. Now here we must anew have something done together by common effort and done very quickly. And this is all. Now I hope that development will lead towards it. This is one of the consequences of coexistence.
We've hedged. We've all had our own development programs going on. I would like to see us go ahead and put it all in one pot. Get out of the development business effectively as a government, and let that money be spent through the United Nations. This would assume that the Soviets would do the same thing. As of now, neither our government nor the Soviet government would do this on any but the limited scale that presently exists.
Well, I could give you an example, a very striking one. 2 years back, we took a vote during the General Assembly of UNESCO to create an European Institute for Social Sciences in Vienna. We created it. The vote was unanimous. Nobody hoped at its beginnings it will yield any results at all. We have 10 big projects, international projects going on, in each of them from 6 to 10 countries, in domains that were absolutely taboo before. Now we have a cooperation of East and West, it means socialist countries, capitalist countries in Europe, expanding now also to United States and other parts of the world.
The gap between practice and theory is, of course, enormous, both in the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, I don't know what the trends are going to be. Probably both systems moving perhaps in directions that reduce the tensions that presently exist in the economic sense.
Which are the causes of these new openings, the new climate and so on? I think this is just a consequence of a very complicated social machinery working now, working in the framework of peaceful coexisting, bringing people together just because they must come closer, they must because they make a sort of a fight, and there is a logical consequence. And there is one problem more, which should be stressed. It is not only a problem of ideology, and not only a problem of culture, and not only a problem of scientific exchanges and so on. It is a very simple, and I would say in a special sense of the word, materialistic element, namely the problem of international trade.
I think that governments consistently underestimate their people. I certainly think that's true of the United States government. I think the people of this country are willing to take a much bolder course than our government has taken in the international field. I mean, a bolder course toward peace. I think that they're less obsessed by slogans than our people in Washington sometimes think they are. I'm not even critical of Washington when I say that. It's awfully easy to get isolated down there and forget that there is such a thing as public opinion, or worry about it in the wrong way. I think a bold move or two in the direction of a more sensible kind of coexistence would be supported by the people of this country.
So the consequence of coming nearer, of having a closer cooperation, of having a more stabilized coexistence should mean that in time being we shall turn together towards the underdeveloped countries to help them economically, to help them also from the point of view of culture, science and so on. Now in this domain we could do already now much more than we are doing.
We have a general agreement, in principle at least, that the domination of one nation or group of nations by another is intolerable, and that mutual aid and cooperation is the best basis for the relationships between nations. We have the possibility of raising standards of living and opportunity through international cooperation, an immense incentive to peace? Is it really only the scourge of war or the lash of terror that can move us towards the goal of peace and justice in the world? Can we not make the effort to advance out of our own sense of responsibility and knowledge, rather than be driven like refugees before a storm?
No, my feeling is that if we could accept the spread of the great revolution of abundance to all mankind as a central fact in our international policies, join together as nations and governments to do the tasks that can be done because the resources are there, then I think we'd find that it was the most exciting job, the most thrilling thing that we could do in human history, and it would be a great adventure for man and a great, great development for the concept of the single human family.
International cooperation is only just beginning. A United Nations fisheries expert in Ceylon. Modern communications side by side with tradition in West Africa. The United Nations General Assembly.
And cooperation of representatives in helping me to reach a consensus under the present difficult circumstances.
International cooperation to save the temples of Abu Simbel from the fast-rising waters of the Nile. Ethiopia. Modern methods of prenatal care being learned in practice. In crises such as Suez and Cyprus, international peacekeeping troops under the United Nations flag.